Alrighty, looks like we have everybody we need here. So I'm going to call to order this meeting of the Citizens Independent Redistricting Commission. Ms. Tilton, can you please call a roll for the commissioners? Looks like you're muted.
Okay, Commissioner Turley. I'm sorry, First District Commissioner Trotsky.
Here.
First
Here.
District Commissioner Twibell.
Present.
Second District Commissioner McClintock.
Present.
Second District Vice Chair Turley.
Present.
Third District Commissioner Bradley.
Present.
And we did hear in advance that Commissioner Hudley of the Third District is unable to be at this meeting tonight. Fourth District Commissioner Bray.
Present.
Fourth District Commissioner Ochoa.
Present.
And I think we're waiting for Chair Morris. Fifth District Commissioner Rios.
Present.
And Member at Large Commissioner Olmedo.
Present.
We believe that Chair Morris will be joining us later. Before we begin, I'd like to go over how the public can participate during the public comment. Today's meeting is remote, virtual only through the Zoom webinar information identified on the public agenda. The meeting is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the internet at www.countyofsb.org/redistricting.sbc. Public participation during the meeting can only be done through the Zoom webinar link or by calling the phone number provided on the agenda. For those using the Zoom webinar link, please indicate that you wish to speak during public comment by selecting the Raise Your Hand feature. Attendees by phone can raise your hand by pressing *9. When called upon, please state your name for the record. We reserve the right to mute a microphone for profane, harassing, or offensive language, or for speaking beyond the time limit set. The time limit for public comment is set at 3 minutes. Recordings of the commission meetings, agendas, supplemental materials, and minutes of the commission are available on the internet at the same redistricting page cited earlier at www.countyofsb.org/redistricting.sbc.
Thank you, Ms. Tilton. And I think we are going to go to disclosures of ex parte communications next, if that's correct.
Yes, and we do want to point out for the public that the ex parte communications are posted on the commission website at www.countyofsb.org/redistricting.sbc. If there are any commissioners who did not have the opportunity to log any ex parte communications, now would be the appropriate time to make those announcements.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah, Chair. Mm-hmm.
I would just like to mention that Commissioner McClintock and I met in March to discuss some outreach efforts for District 2. So that would be March 21st.
And I would just note for the audience listening that I did check and kudos to Commissioner Bradley for entering a number of contacts in there. So the commissioners are getting their entries in there, and encourage folks to keep an eye on those lists.
Excellent. All right, let's move on to public comment if we don't have any additional ex parte communications to report. Is there anybody raising their hand?
Yes, we do have requests to speak from Lee Heller, followed by Scott Rafferty.
Excellent.
Acting Chair Turley and members of the commission, nice to see your faces after a couple of weeks. I happened to be observing the Board of Supervisors yesterday when they received a briefing about the census. And the reason I'm bringing it up is it sounds like there was a really well organized and concerted outreach effort that reported to SBCAG from the best I could tell, but involved something like 100 organizations. Pedro Paz from the Santa Barbara Foundation was involved, and Joni Maiden, who I think is his SBCAG, but I can't swear to that. So I just wanted to bring this to your attention because it may be that the structures that they used for their outreach would be something that this commission could use as well, or their lists or their processes. So it might be worth reaching out to them to find out what they did and what you could piggyback onto. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the next request to speak is from Scott Rafferty.
Hello, I just wanted to offer a few thoughts. First of all, I received only in the last week and a half some documents that had been promised more than a month ago. And they're very concerning regarding the ex parte practices and lack of transparency of the commission. In that connection, I would have liked to have written remarks that could be posted in your packet. However, you have a provision that it has to be done more than 24 hours before your meeting, which means there's less than 48 hours after your agenda to prepare something. That's not transparency. And that's not really, you can see from the fact that Dr. Heller and I are the only people that comment that you really have not succeeded at engaging with the community. And practices like that, which I know that the chairman doesn't think I know very much about the Brown Act, but I've had success this year since the pandemic in both in demand letters and in a larger number of just negotiated settlements. This is one of the most restrictive provisions I've seen, and I don't think it's defensible. So I hope you'll reconsider that and try to be more transparent. On the same line, you have ex parte comments on the agenda, but there really needs to be a report that people can react to. They shouldn't have to go searching through videos to find out what your ex parte practices are. And there's certainly, you need to fix these things. And finally, because I may not comment later, I have read Dr. Johnson's report, but one wonders when the most important job of counsel is to validate that something that the map complies with the Voting Rights Act. Why counsel isn't giving that presentation, particularly when you have Professor Levitt, who is just an outstanding expert in this area. There's at least one point where I don't think Dr. Johnson is correct. And I hope your counsel is particularly attentive. I understand he's going to give a presentation next month on the Voting Rights Act. But, I hope you right this ship because it's a matter of concern for those of us who work elsewhere in the state trying to make independent redistricting work. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Tilton, do we have any additional hands raised?
I see no further hands raised at this time.
Okay, all right. Let's move on to the approval of the minutes of the March 17th meeting, please. Commissioner Bradley?
I move to approve the minutes of March 17.
I'll second.
Great, we have a second. Can we take a vote, please?
Yes, and I'm sorry, I didn't hear who did the second.
Commissioner McClintock.
McClintock, thank you. Commissioner Trotsky,
Aye.
Commissioner Twibell,
Aye.
Commissioner McClintock,
Aye.
Commissioner Bradley,
Aye.
Commissioner Bray,
Aye.
Commissioner Ochoa.
Aye.
I don't believe Chair Morris has joined us. Commissioner Rios,
Aye.
Commissioner Olmedo,
Aye.
and Vice Chair Turley.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay. So let's move on to item 5 on our agenda, the introduction of our legal team.
You're muted, Andrea. I too have a cat. This is Andrea Orden from Strumwasser-Wucher, and very pleased to be here as your legal counsel today. And I wanted to introduce you to Salvador Perez, who is a fairly recent addition to the firm, coming to us first from Big Law and also from clerking with the Ninth Circuit with one of our outstanding justices, Judge Murguia. So that's who we have here today. And we may be visited by Fred Wucher, who thought he might be able to stop by during part of the time. I think you will see as we go through this rotations in terms of the various persons who are going to present, and we will be responsible next time for the Voter Rights Act presentation. So I'm looking forward to that as well, and looking forward to the presentation tonight.
Let's move on to review of legal counsel on the Brown Act, please.
Well, today we were going to talk about the Brown Act just in, I understand that you already have been trained in general on the Brown Act. And these are, we thought, just a few of the questions that have been raised in general and in some of the areas that you feel particularly concerned about. And well, of course, one of them is the ex parte disclosures and the extent to which, casual conversations in the market or at school, when school now is opening, picking up children, becomes ex parte communications. And I think what you've done already is the right answer, which is to err on the side of full disclosure. And exactly as we have talked about, and I've heard you talking about before, in terms of making everything as public and transparent as you can. But nevertheless, many times you are going to be talking to people who might have an interest in redistricting, but the conversation never comes up. And the ex parte communication is designed to be a conversation related to the work of this commission. And I did see also, as we've already noted, that one commissioner has indeed put his outreach efforts on the website, which I found quite easy to find as on my way to prepare for this meeting. So I encourage everybody to utilize that and to adhere to the words in the ordinance that were put there just exactly to ensure impartiality and full disclosure of what we hope, what we just genuinely hope will be a lot of interest in the public who will want to talk about it. And we welcome Chair Morris. It's good to see you. And so that's one of the issues that I thought we would talk about, I would mention, and then open it up for any questions that you have. The other issue is the social media communications. As I was sharing with Sal earlier today, I am very fortunately not on social media and find that to be very comfortable for me. Nevertheless, most of us are. And the legislature has been concerned that social media being such a free way of communicating and so easy to do a single click to approve or like somebody's conversation, that it could be very easy to fall into looking as if you were having a meeting with other members of the group. It could look also, if you're talking to general members of the public, that you are having ex parte communications related to your work. So the legislation is designed to restrict your communications among the commissioners about the matters related to your work. And so it just also seems, just as a matter of common sense, this does not seem a very restrictive provision. The public wants to hear from you in your public meetings here, and not through social media, and in that way you will more easily be able to communicate clearly what is the mission of your commission and the accuracy of what you are doing. I think someone just said something. No, raised a hand. Obviously, any kinds of anything that you feel is questionable. One of the things that's why we're here, and you certainly are entitled to contact your counsel about, especially if you have a very visible and an active social media of what would be appropriate and not appropriate to do. I think there was a further issue that we were going to talk about. Sal, would you remind me just this moment, there was another one besides the social media?
Sure, there were a number of other ones. Socializing among the commissioners was something that was raised as a topic of conversation.
That's right. I was struck when I watched one of your prior meetings before we became council by some excellent presentations that you had. And one of the presentations for a former commissioner encouraged your getting to know each other, and found that in the kind of work you're going to be doing and can turn into very stressful work at a certain point, it is wonderful to know each other and to feel that you're working together as a team. And one of the ways you do that is by socializing. And I just need to caution, I was very surprised when they said that they actually got together as a group, the entire quorum plus group for socialization. Basically, the Brown Act is very concerned that all of anything that would lead to deliberation or anything that would look like a meeting be done only in public. So if you are in a social environment, and even if you're not talking about the work, and it is a majority of the commission, it's going to be a meeting. And even if you weren't truly deliberating, it is a meeting. So I would like to say that we certainly encourage relationship and being able to know each other. And I certainly agreed that I'm sure that made that decision-making much easier. But it has to be in smaller groups. And maybe you'll remember also from the prior training that it's very easy to appear to have a meeting, even when you didn't think you did. It's if 2 or 3 of you are meeting together and then talking about appropriately about the issues that are coming before the commission. And then one of those 2 or 3 then meets with another 2 or 3 and shares views and deliberates about these issues. And maybe perhaps another one meets with another 2 or 3. This could look very much as if you really are having a meeting under the Brown Act a serial meeting. You're doing it in bits and pieces as they come along, but it is still going to be a quorum and therefore a meeting that should have been in public. There, in not so much in your situation, but in many governmental situations, the commission will have an executive officer, and the executive officer very appropriately will meet privately with the officers. For example, 5 supervisors will meet independently with supervisors to assist on various issues. It is very important that in that sort of serial meeting, that the individual who is briefing all of the other 5 is not acting as a conduit for information and basically deliberation and coming to a decision. So that is another reason, while you're talking about having social relationships among the commissioners, to be very aware that you are prohibited by the Brown Act for having such meetings, such relationships and such time together that could turn into a meeting that is prohibited. So those were just 2 or 3 of the, or 3 of the things that I think constantly come up. And probably the best thing to do is to bring those to my attention or any of our attention if you have an issue, and in fact, if you have one now. I don't see any hands raised at the second, but very happy to just do on issues as they arise. Yes, hi.
And we do have 2 hands raised from the public for public comment. So whenever that's appropriate, we can
Right.
take this.
Thank you, Andrea. Just a quick question. If you just mentioned to an individual that you're an appointed commissioner, but don't discuss any of the business, just say, oh, by the way, I am on the commission. Does that raise it to the level of ex parte if there's nothing discussion about the commission other than you have been appointed?
Right. It certainly doesn't fit the purpose behind an ex parte disclosure. What do you do? Oh, I have this commission. Of course, that conversation could continue for a while, and they say, well, what is it that you really do? Oh my gosh, I know something about that. Or it's once you have disclosed that and you're in that official capacity before that person, it's kind of easy to become more like an ex parte communication. But there is nothing wrong about having that ex parte communication as so long as you disclose it. So I think it's just a question of at what point do you need to disclose it? And if you're just saying that's what I do for a living and the person nods, I don't think that needs to be disclosed. But again, maybe especially as we're beginning this process, to go out of our way to be more transparent than not.
Let me guess ahead at a question that's likely to come up down the line is, once the commission has kind of official marketing materials, as commissioners forward those materials, if they're to groups they know of, do they need to disclose if they're simply forwarding official material?
If you look at that, the phrase in the ordinance, it does not. But today, one of the commissioners went out of his way to say, I sent emails, I sent marketing materials, and I want you to know that I was doing that. So I think it's not that onerous to do the disclosures. And it also, in the way I think, tells the public, I'm out there, I'm doing these things, I'm communicating. So although it probably is not required under the ordinance, it may be that you will decide that that's a good policy, even when it's in terms of outreach, just outreach. Yes.
Thank you, Andrea. So if I were to get together with another commissioner just to have lunch and just to get to know that person, that's considered something that needs to be documented. And we don't discuss what happened in the meetings or future meetings. That would need to be disclosed.
I mean, each time the commissioners, Sal, you know, when we were talking about this before, the commissioners ought to be able to be discussing among themselves. I think, again, the ex parte provision seems to be more related to the outside influences designed to be something to influence. You are supposed to be able to discuss amongst yourselves. Sal, have you got a thought on that, an additional thought?
No, I think as a matter of the ordinance, you wouldn't have to disclose that. But if the question is particularly with respect to the Brown Act implications of that type of outing, I think it would be perfectly appropriate for a group of commissioners that constitute less than the quorum to get together in a social setting, as long as you don't discuss commission business.
And a group, sometimes that's what subcommittees also, in terms of subcommittees, are about, and committees. You're getting together as a committee, less than a quorum, and you are permitted to meet together insofar as you're not a standing committee that has special responsibilities for decision making. But you can set up various committees in order to work together. So I guess really back to where you were, Cheryl, that I would think just the two of you speaking, that's not what the ordinance had in mind.
I can add two kind of a tales from the road on this stuff. When we worked with the Arizona Redistricting Commission, where they would go on, multi-day trips together where they do field hearings. So of course they're going to end up often eating together. They always made sure that at least one of their legal counsel was at the table with them. So that should anyone wander into, hey, what'd you think of the meeting last night? Or what'd you think of so-and-so's comment last night? They would quickly get smacked on the hand. So I do encourage when we are able to get together, if we end up traveling different parts of the county and, having long meetings where you end up eating together, it's always a good idea to have one of the legal team there just to make sure that nothing inappropriate or nothing business related comes up too. They can both represent and police you, I guess is the way to look at it.
Right. And remind, maybe just remind them that it could appear to be that kind of a meeting. And and I think if you were having those very long meetings, you probably would be too tired to talk about anything like that in any of it over dinner.
Yes, exactly.
Well, maybe we'll turn to public comment then, if there aren't any other hands up.
We do have two requests to speak. We have a request from Scott Rafferty, followed by Andy Caldwell.
Well, Scott Rafferty, I am confused by some of this. There are the legal requirements, which are not just the Brown Act, but they're also your ordinance, and they're also your bylaws. And they should work together to have you be proactively transparent. If someone wants to find out your ex parte rules, they should be able to go to the front page and find it very easily. If they want to find out your schedule, they should find it very easily. They shouldn't have to sift through every agenda packet of every meeting you've ever had or listen to all the videos. And the goal should be that a person should have as much information as you've given to any individual, should be available to everyone easily. And the biggest loophole in your bylaws is this notion that someone can make a comment to you and say, don't post it. That is antithetical to the kind of transparency, proactive transparency that you want to have. It means the most secretive and perhaps most influential comments can be made effectively ex parte. And that's wrong. The Brown Act is mostly about legislative bodies. And I agree with Mr. Churchwell. I think you're not a legislative body in that sense. You should aspire to be a quasi-judicial body, because if you adopt that role, then you're going to be very hard to be defeated in litigation. And the key to that is avoiding all ex parte contacts. And you can avoid them by not initiating them or responding to them. And if somebody comes up and blurts out the address of someone, of one of the superintendents, that's an ex parte you can't avoid and you should report. But instead of having these conversations with reporters or whatever, and then disclosing that you had a conversation without saying what you said, which can be very confusing, can raise more answers that raise more questions than it answers. You should put out a press release and direct the reporter to the press release and post the press release. Then everybody is on the same ground. The most sensitive information you can tell someone is when you're going to consider a particular issue or how you feel about a particular issue. Those are procedural. And because they're procedural, everyone should be on the same level playing field. So I think it's a question of being proactively transparent. And the social media rule for legislative bodies is you can say whatever you want individually now. You just can't react to each other. Even if you're not a quorum, you can't reply, you can't forward another commissioner's comment or like or dislike it. But I think that's bright line is intended for legislative bodies, but given that you are really acting as administrative judges, acting as agents for the voters, you should have a higher standard. Thank you.
And then the next speaker is Andy Caldwell.
Chairman Morris, members of the commission. I actually don't disagree. I know the Brown Act, we've litigated it before. I don't actually disagree with anything that your counsel said or even what Mr. Rafferty said, but I think they may be missing the point. A lot of people are expecting you to be ambassadors for this redistricting commission. And in that regard, we expect you to be talking to as many people as you can and reporting it. So instead of, I think the impetus here is better not talk to anybody because you'd have to report it. I think the focus should be the exact opposite. Talk to as many organizations, citizens, civic groups, reporters, talk to as many people as you can, but report it. Don't form a serial meeting, don't collude with another commissioner, but you're supposed to be ambassadors. So I actually plan on having some of you on my radio show, which airs on 3 stations across the region, because I feel like you should be talking to the public and explaining what you're doing, why it's important. So I think the caution should be there, but it should not be caution to the point of timidity or silence. It should just be caution to the point of caution. And I encourage you to talk to Rotary clubs, Kiwanis clubs, and then plus, of course, in this day and age, social media is the way you reach more people with the least amount of cost and effort. And you will have a problem because you don't know who you're talking to, you know? And so I just think you say, hey, I posted on social media about the meeting or how do we get involved? But I just think the emphasis has been a caution versus go forth. And I think that the go forth is the most important thing you could do, because I professionally go to meetings. That's my job. It's lonely going to meetings. You're not going to get very many people to come to this webinar, and you're lucky to get people to come once we go have community meetings. You might get a few coming, but the most press you're going to get is through the press or through social media to get the word out and get the submission. So I would just, like I said, emphasize a different part of the message to you. Thank you.
And I see no more hands raised. And Chair Morris joined us several minutes ago. I think maybe even 20 minutes ago.
Apologies, everybody, for being late. I thought I had my evening together a little better. Megan, thank you for stepping in and getting us rolling. I appreciate that.
Happy to hand it back to you.
Very good. Any further questions or anybody want to throw any hypotheticals at Ms. Orden that you're curious about on this item, or are we ready to move on?
Well, I'll just say one more thing, because I did at one point say, there's something about having to report that made ex parte communication sound as if it was something that you were not proud of. And I tried to say that, part of your goal is to be out there and communicating and being asked questions and hearing comments. And so it may be somewhat burdensome, but it should be seen as part of exactly what your mission is, which is to truly be involved with the community and truly listening to the community.
Yeah, absolutely. Ms. Turley.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to something that you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation in regards to social media. And I was wondering if Mr. Perez could comment a little bit more about an example of an appropriate social media post versus an example of an inappropriate interaction on social media, just so that we have kind of an idea of the parameters.
Sure. So prior to January of this year, the Brown Act did not address social media. And the amendments that were made to it affected two things. First of all, it authorized people such as yourselves to interact with the public. And I'll be specific here and quote the actual law. You can answer questions, you can provide information, and you can solicit information from the public. That's the first part. The second part is a prohibition. And the prohibition is that you cannot respond directly to any social media posts made or shared by other commissioners. So you cannot interact as commissioners regarding commission business on social media. So you can't like, you can't share, you can't in any way participate or demonstrate some type of interaction with another post made by another commissioner. So an example of something that would be appropriate would be to share commission agendas for upcoming meetings. You can invite the public to attend, hopefully as vaccinations get distributed more widely and the possibility of in-person meetings becomes clearer later this year, you can invite the public to an in-person meeting, that sort of thing. Distributing information is a good way to think about it, and receiving information from the public. The prohibition, again, is interacting with your co-commissioners. So even if you are inclined to like something and appreciate something that another commissioner did online, you should not do that.
Commissioner Rios.
Yeah, so a follow-up to that, say it was on marketing materials, but I had my own file, like is it appropriate for, say, a commissioner and I to post the same thing just individually? I don't know if that
Yes.
makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, you are independently doing the same thing. That is not interaction. That would be fine.
And then is this specifically interaction around commission related issues or any interaction online?
Commission business. That's right.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So, Mr. Johnson, thinking about the volume of these reporting we're going to have to do, I think I have a new business opportunity for you. I appreciate the online form. Now you just need to turn it into an app, because if I have to remember the details even back to my desk, today I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I will double check with Kristen, but I think that the form you use actually will work fine on your phone too.
I'm teasing. Yeah.
Because it is true. It's going to be hard to keep track. Hopefully, it will be hard to keep track of how many contacts you're having, because you'll have so many.
I figure if you turn it into an app, you could license it to commissions all around the country. Any other comments or questions on this item? All right, let's move on then. I believe we are on item.
Chair Morris, I just realized I failed to read the public comments submitted.
Oh, very well.
The written comments submitted. We did receive correspondence from Jim Fox regarding the redistricting process in general and providing a resource for a guide on redistricting. And then we received an email from Catherine Overman inquiring how redistricting will affect Carpinteria. So I've been working with Chair Morris. We'll be getting a response to her and directing her to, inviting her to engage in the process and see how it unfolds, and providing input on communities of interest that she may be familiar with, especially with Carpinteria. That is all.
All right, very good. So if I've caught up here, I believe we're on agenda item 7, which, Mr. Johnson, I believe this is probably yours to start us off with as we talk about outreach planning and our next steps in that regard.
Yes, so thank you. We have been busy after your last meeting over the last couple of weeks, and worked with county staff who have been fantastic. And I see you're appearing now with Jen from Trepepe Smith to get them on board to do the things we talked about at the last meeting of really helping to get all of our marketing and communications materials ready. So this is all about various commissioners that have talked about having a presentation and a flyer. Maybe we even do an informational video and things you can share on social media. The other piece that we've been talking about is, the county staff did a great job of getting a website up quickly that allows meeting by meeting posting. But as you're likely feeling, I'm certainly feeling, the site needs to evolve into something that has, meeting by meeting information, and then resources and materials easily available, things like that. So they will also be helping with all of that. So wanted to introduce her. She's representing a very large team from Trepepe Smith that we have worked with on numerous redistricting projects. And I think that's the best part of this, is they already speak redistricting. So with that, I will introduce Jen and let you introduce yourself.
Well, hopefully, Ms. Nowig, you not only speak redistricting, but you can speak it in, language the rest of us can understand.
Absolutely, yeah, and thank you, Doug. Good evening, Chair Morris and fellow members of the commission. As Doug mentioned, my name is Jen Nentwig. I'm a director with the public affairs firm Trepepe Smith. And also, as Doug mentioned, we do have a fairly large team. We have about 25 different communications experts, ranging in skill sets from communication planning to videography to photography to graphic design. And we are really excited to help out with those various opportunities for Santa Barbara County and for the commission in particular. We do have a lot of experience working closely with your communications manager. So we have experience in the county working on various issues and projects. And also, as Doug mentioned, we are familiar with redistricting, working this year with various counties and cities across the state. So we're looking forward to this opportunity. And then just to give a little bit of a sample and taste of the various tasks that we're prepared to jump in and help with, we'll start out by working with you on a general outreach plan. I know some of that outreach has already begun, but we'll look to just make sure that you have the right tools in place for that. We'll also be ready to jump in and help with social media. So whether that is just developing the content or helping you get established on various platforms. I believe that the commission does have the ability and permission to launch your own social media platform. So we're ready to jump in and help out with that, depending on the guidance that we hear from you. We'll also be ready to develop press releases in various languages throughout the process, as well as flyers using our graphic design expertise, both flyers and PowerPoint presentations, I should say, for various engagements that may come up. And we will be working together with the county staff and with NDC to hopefully eventually scout out some in-person forums for engagement as the process moves forward. And lastly, as Doug alluded to, we'll be ready to jump in and assist with website content and or a strategy for a different website platform, whatever that turns out to be that will work best for you. So with that, I just wanted to share a brief introduction, give you some examples of some things we're excited to help out with, and open it up for any questions that you may have.
So before we jump into that, I wanted to just also share with the commission, as they develop these materials, we expect that they'll be moving fairly quickly, and to kind of streamline that facilitation process, I'd like to, we've talked about appointing a subcommittee again, similar to the way we've done with other tasks with the commission to kind of be their initial go-to group for quick reaction, assisting to get the materials kind of to a almost finished standpoint, and then bring them back to the full commission once they're kind of mostly baked. And so I've asked Megan Turley, Jim Bray, and Chris Hudley to kind of serve as a task force to work with Doug and Jennifer and their teams in that regard. So now we have lots of people working on this. So Doug, did you want to get into any details on this process, or do we want to just do it as a Q&A format?
I think I would just add one thought that came up at the last meeting to reinforce, and we've talked to Jen about this, is the idea is for them to provide a ton of support, and they're great at that, not to be the face of the commission. So it's still going to be you, the commissioners. It's going to be the outreach committee that we're still talking about, but bringing in the other applicants and kind of that outreach group. So the goal of Trip Smith is to provide the materials that everyone will be sharing, not to be the face of the commission themselves. So that was the other thought I was going to add. Just want to check in real quick with Gina DePinto, the communications manager for the county, and see if she had any thoughts to add. But obviously she'll be working, advising closely with this to make sure we know how to tap into the county channels. Gina, anything you wanted to add?
Absolutely. No, just thank you so much. And Jen, great job kind of giving an overview of outreach and some of the elements and tactics that we'll be using, and just want everyone to be assured that of course we'll be working closely together to utilize and take advantage of the existing communication channels that the county has. But we of course need the support. You are an independent commission, so I want to make sure that we've got that nice go-between. So thank you.
Commissioner Bradley, did I see a hand up a minute ago? Right. Okay, Commissioner Bray, and then Commissioner Reeves.
Thank you, Chair Morris. Thank you, Ms. Nitwig. Quick question. You're out of Orange County, is that correct?
Yes.
Or your organization is? And how familiar are you with Santa Barbara County, and particularly the different audiences that we need to communicate with? Do you have any expertise, or how well do you know this community, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I had mentioned earlier, Trip Smith has worked closely with the County of Santa Barbara on earlier crises and various issues. I know that we have experience with the communications manager, Gina, that goes years back. And as far as knowledge of the community in particular, for every community that we engage with, we would do research to understand the demographics, working closely with NDC, look at prior election year data, and really assess the environment based upon that data first and foremost. And then we would also be looking forward to engaging closely with you as the commissioners and as those ambassadors, if you will, that were mentioned earlier, to really make sure that we're getting the latest and greatest information about what the community is currently tuned in on, and make sure that we have those networks out into the community as well.
Commissioner Rios.
That was actually similar to my question. Considering how unique our communities are, every area is very different. Oftentimes we have to be very intentional in the language and, what we put on the flyer, whether it's too wordy or not too wordy pictures. And so just to confirm, we would have a say in that, right? Like when the materials came out, we wouldn't automatically release them. And that it be beyond the task force that will be assisting with this, right?
Yes, I can chime in on that and speak to how I think the process will flow. So I think part of what your commission is looking to do is get that subcommittee established, and that could also include outreach groups. And we actually already have a very similar process already underway with another county on their COVID communications actually, but through a similar process, they have outreach groups that connect with various I don't want to say underserved, but hard to reach communities where they do need to have some insight on how the translations are completed and what images resonate with various communities. So I could very well see a similar process working well for your county, where there are items drafted, and then either through this commission or through that outreach group, we get feedback on what particular translation works best and what resonates the best.
And
If I could add, they're not going to have to recreate the wheel. We'll definitely be working close together because, of course, county has, some of that specific information about our community and some of the efforts that we are using currently for COVID-19. And I know Lee Heller mentioned earlier, Census had already shared our Census committee, our complete count committee with NDC, and kind of fleshing that out even more in a lot of the organizations, and Mixteco and Indigenous, as an example, is not a written language, so it's not one of our required 5, but we of course do communicate using our organizations in the county who have that contact and that network, so that we can at least produce videos and other digital communications translated from Spanish into Mixteco. So we'll be working closely with TRPEPI.
And I would just add to the question of approvals and reviews, I think that's certainly a vital part of the subcommittee, is that they'll be the ones deciding what they're okay signing off on and what should come back to the whole commission. It won't be NDC, it won't be TRPEPI Smith deciding that. It'll be commissioners deciding what should come to the whole commission for review. And we do expect a lot of the materials to come back. So that's part of the reason for getting this going quickly, is to get drafts going, so we do have that time to come to the commission before we really hit the streets and take the material out to the people.
Yeah, Commissioner Turley.
Yeah, I would say that if the outreach subcommittee is going to be responsible for a lot of the approvals and kind of early feedback on this, that we should have at least one person on the commission, the subcommittee, who speaks Spanish.
Yeah. Anybody want to volunteer?
I'd like to volunteer if there is no one else who wants to take that on. Or yeah, it'd be my pleasure.
You're there. Thank you, Ms. Rios.
And we haven't actually discussed that aspect of outreach yet, but just so that everyone, knows that at the county, we require certified translation and interpreters. So there's no question, because there's so many different conjugations. And so even for the materials that the county translates, it's not just someone who can speak Spanish. It's helpful to check things, but just know that we will be using certified translation. not Google.
Very good. Any other comments or discussion from the commission? Mr. Turley?
Yeah, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about the cost.
Yeah, so I'll answer that first. So we worked with the county on kind of what their budget was, or what it wasn't a formal budget, but what their thinking was in terms of how much this would cost. So we're expecting over the course of this to stay under $50,000. It will be kind of front loaded, I think, in large part, as they develop a lot of these materials, and less so on the back end when it's more people carrying the materials out. But they will have ongoing responsibilities for press releases, and one thing I think may take a number of meetings is figuring out exactly their role in the website versus, how much they'll do, how much the county web team will be doing, and all that. So that may be an ongoing thing too. But that's the thought, is keep it below 50,000, and it's on a time and materials basis. So.
Thank you.
Okay, before we leave this item, let me just see if there's anybody on the public attendee side that has a comment they'd like to make. Raise your hand. We'll pause for a moment.
I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Okay. Well, Ms. Nedwick, we welcome you to the team, and look forward to lots of really amazing materials and resources, like yesterday, right? So thank you for agreeing to work with us.
Thank you. We're looking forward to it too.
All right, folks, let's go on with our agenda. We're on item number 8. This is another of our training sessions. Today, we're going to talk about what are the criteria that we're able to consider, able and or must consider once we get to actually drawing the maps. So, Mr. Johnson, again, I'm assuming you'll start us off?
Yes, so my apologies, the second time you'll have to listen to me. As was mentioned, at the next meeting on voting rights, the Stromwasser and Wooster team will take the lead. So bear with me through today. But we tend to find this is fairly interesting, so hopefully I'll do it justice today. And it's worth noting, as we'll get into, you have a particularly complicated situation facing you. So one thing, we posted this back with the agenda on Friday. So just, those of you that looked already, I'm not reading all these slides. There is quite a bit of text, but the public has these, they've been posted, and of course, people can refer back to them. This is the rather wordy language of the county code that was approved by the voters in terms of what the criteria are for drawing maps. So I highlighted in purple the key phrases. You've got, as you might expect, equal population up front, and these are in prioritized order. Then compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. Oh, I forgot to highlight the California Voting Rights Act. Then I'm going to talk a lot about this next provision about Elections Code 21500 and the list that follows it. But you start to see the challenges facing you. You have contiguity in 4, and then contiguity in 5. You have communities of interest in 4 and in 6. So we'll go through all this. The one thing I do want to highlight from this text is you do have this reference, and you're going to learn a little bit about the challenges of statutory construction and writing these things. But one of the things that happened in writing the ordinance was the ABCD listed in number 4 is taken straight out of what was Elections Code 21500 at the time, with one interesting twist of they said shall, which is in law, shall means you must give consideration to these. As I'll show in the next slide, at the time the law was written, 21500 said the board may give consideration. So the authors of this took the language from the existing law and just changed that one word, but that one word has a lot of impact. And then in something that couldn't have been foreseen, and this is the danger of referring to statutes and then quoting them, is the legislature rewrote 21500. So instead of being this short list of 4 things, it's now all the text you see on the right. and very similar criteria, just in a different order from the primary original language. So as you hear confusion from the public, and as you feel confusion, and you hear about is this first or is that first, as you go through this process, know that that gut instinct is right. You have this mix of requirements. And so boiling them down and taking out a lot of the surrounding language, this is a slide really to go through just the pure requirements. And this is really what you should have as your quick reference. When you're looking at maps and you're evaluating maps, number one is equal population, and I'll go through all these in more detail. Number one is equal population. Number two is the Federal Voting Rights Act. Number three is the California Voting Rights Act. Then number four, we have this mix now of the new language of Elections Code 21500, because the statute referred to 21500, and the old language of 21500 that was written into the ordinance with, I don't put it here, but with the shall requirement. And then they come back into ordinance specific criteria of contiguous neighborhoods and communities of interest, which of course is also up in 4, and then compact. So this, it will generally work out when you go back and look at maps and face trade-offs and choices. You'll have to face these trade-offs and choices based on where these items are in the list of criteria. And generally, I think you'll wrestle with this a lot, but I tend to go with the first time an item appears. But this is something that you can debate, that the legal team will weigh in on as we get specific questions and specific instances as well. But this is really your list of criteria. So let me walk through what these different things mean. Oh, I almost forgot. So those are the things you must do. And then of course there is the prohibition. You cannot consider incumbent or candidate locations, nor may you favor or discriminate against any incumbent candidate or political party. So that's the don't, and then the other list is your do's. So let me jump in equal population. As we've talked about, there will be all these different redistricting efforts going on at the same time. The state will be doing state legislative districts, the cities will be doing their districts, the schools will be doing their districts. There are two different rules for equal population. One applies to Congress. The Congressional Rule, and the reason they're different is that the Congressional Rule comes out of Article 1 of the Constitution that says equal number of persons, essentially. I'm paraphrasing, but equal number of persons. And the courts have said that means essentially near perfect balance, down to one person. So there's no rule of thumb for congressional districts. You have to be within 1% or anything like that. Technically, the rule is one person, which is a little crazy given everything we all know about the census and that we've talked about the census. So thankfully for everyone else other than Congress, the equal population requirement comes out of the 14th Amendment. It's an equal protection rule. And it's often referred to as a simple rule of thumb. You have to be within plus or minus 5% of the ideal per district population. But I do want to clarify that is a rule of thumb. The actual rule is that there must be no more than 10% difference between the largest and smallest. So if your largest seat is over by 5%, your smallest seat is under by 5%, that's a 10% spread. Now, with 5 districts, you can get a little creative in this. In theory, one seat could be 8% underpopulated or 8% overpopulated if all 4 other seats are exactly 2% the other way. So you'd have that 10% spread. Now, the odds that you could do that while still following, without splitting up cities and things like that are pretty slim. But you do have that flexibility to have one seat that kind of is different than the others if you need to, within that 10% spread. And it does have to be for a very specific court-approved reason, one of your other criteria to justify that split. But that is the rule. So how do we figure this math? Well, first of all, we have to know what population data we're using. And as we've talked about before, the state has come out and said, this is different than before. The state has come out and said that counties and cities shall use the decennial census data, the official decennial census data, with one modification, which is the incarcerated persons in state prisons. And we don't have to do that math. The state is going to issue that database with this data. So they have declared you do have to use this data. And we calculate the balance by taking the whole population. So as an illustration, I've taken the county's 2010 population, which was just under 424,000. Divide that by the number of districts. So you end up with 423,895 divided by 5. And that's where you got the number for 10 years ago of 84,779. Each district, the population in each district in a map is then compared to that. You get your deviation and divide the difference between the actual population district versus the ideal. In the case of District 1, it was 323 short at the time it was drawn. And so it's under by 0.38%. And then you get the large, you go through that exercise with all 5. The largest was 0.61 over. So you get your 1% planned deviation. In this case, they were extremely close to 0 and well below 10%. So it was a nice, safe population balance map. Part of the reason that deviation was so small is back in 2010, the rule was you really have to be absolutely as close to 0 as possible. You really had to justify every little deviation and be sure that it was for an appropriate reason. Now that's still the goal, but the legal restraints have somewhat loosened up as a result of this Harris versus Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission case in 2016. The court in that case talked about good faith efforts to comply with the Voting Rights Act was enough, even though partisanship, which the court has said is not a good reason for deviation. You can, even when commissions can consider partisanship, they cannot deviate because of some partisan goal. So even though they had this other goal, it was good, they had good faith. So they've shown kind of more probable than not that this stated justification explains the deviation is an acceptable boundary. So you've got a little bit more flexibility. Still, the closer you get to 10%, the riskier the map gets. You know, the last map at 1%, even if someone disputed an 8% change in the map, they would still be balanced. So we do encourage keeping the deviation small, but for specific goals tied to your criteria, you can deviate as long as that planned deviation stays within 10%. There are some extremely rare examples of folks exceeding 10% deviations. And we always recommend against that. The reason for that is it's not illegal if you exceed 10%, but you get this huge deference from the courts. They've said it's what's called presumptively constitutional. So someone challenging your map has a very high hurdle to cross, as the Arizona plaintiffs did. The moment you hit 10% or cross it, then your plan becomes presumptively unconstitutional, and the whole burden of proof shifts to you. And it's an extremely high hurdle you have to jump. So if anyone was angry with any part of the map, exceeding 10% gives them a really easy door to go in and to get you into court. You might still win, but it makes it a piece of cake to get you into court. That's what I mentioned here. It practically guarantees long, expensive litigation, not because someone's upset about population deviation, but someone who's upset with some other line or some other element of the map. You've given them the keys to get you into court, and you're giving away your discretion. So this is why essentially every speech you ever hear about redistricting will say stick within that 10%. It's a very nice, comfortable, safe harbor. So that's equal population. Let me take a moment here and see if there's any questions from the commission before I jump into the other items.
Commissioner Turley.
Yeah, sorry, I might have missed this, Doug, but you mentioned something about using the incarcerated person data as part of the overall count for each district. Can you go into a little bit more detail about that?
Sure. So this is, you may have heard the phrase prison gerrymandering, which has been an issue mainly in the state of New York, but across the country it's become an issue. So California joined other states in saying we don't want to use the prisons to gerrymander our lines. So the state has been spending the last year plus figuring out the home addresses of all the prisoners that were in state prisons. And they're going to zero out the prison counts and move them to their home addresses for state prisoners. Of course, you have the federal prison in Lompoc. When I asked the state what they're going to do about that, they weren't sure. We think they're just going to zero it out and not move them to somewhere else. But that they didn't have a definite decision on that yet because they can't get the home addresses of federal prisoners. So people in jails will be counted in the jail. They actually are still voters and they're in the same county. People in state prisons will be counted at their last known home address, or if there's no address, just zeroed out. And the prison itself will be zeroed out. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Bradley and then Commissioner Bray.
In Elections Code 21500, you pointed out the wording change to use shall in respect to the word consideration. Can you articulate the semantics of consideration? Does that mean taking action items on, or does that mean giving due diligence and attention to those issues? What precisely and legally does consideration mean?
Well, remember, I'm not your lawyer, so I will give my kind of practitioner's answer and then defer to Ms. Orden or Sal if either one of them wants to chime in too. But when it was May, that was kind of a justification for deviation. So if you were trying to achieve one of the goals listed and it took deviating a little bit from population balance, you could cite that law and you'd be home free on that small deviation. Making it say shall kind of puts it into a checklist, I think, of you need to walk through and make sure that you're paying attention to it. But it is, the law always said may. It's saying shall is a new twist that Santa Barbara has brought to this arena. So I don't have a lot of experience with that. Ms. Orden or Mr. Perez, do you want to add anything to that? Oh, you're muted. Yeah.
So I've not had a direct experience on that. I think Commissioner Bradley was really more concerned about consideration and what consideration meant than shall or may. And I think basically it was exactly what consideration means in terms of common sense. It isn't, you're not driven by it. It's not something that is required. It's not necessarily a checklist, but it's to be taken into account. So I think that's really what consideration is. And then as Douglas has pointed out, by moving to shall, then it does seem to give it a little more importance that you are using and consideration.
Good. Commissioner Bray and then Commissioner Rios.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Hypothetically, if you had to really stretch a district to make that 10% population count, but it's neither compact nor the communities are contiguous, the population still trumps the other two?
In most situations, yes, it comes first. We often semi-jokingly refer to it as the one number that rules them all, because you will undoubtedly get comments from folks saying, we really want to be with, our neighborhood really wants to be with that neighborhood. And well, at some point, not all the neighborhoods that want to be together can be together because you hit that population count. And so it really does come first. And it comes first in the criteria list, which is prioritized, and it's the easiest legal challenge to bring to a map. So you can get into a lot of, should be 0.5% off by 0.5% and not follow the freeway, or go to 1.5% if that lets us follow the freeway. Those are the kind of discussions you get into a lot, but that's all within the context of saying well within 10%.
Good. Commissioner Rios?
My question was kind of answered when you brought up, when you first mentioned the Lompoc prison, and I guess I will mention this now. Will we receive a final answer on what will be done with that prison, just to ensure, so we can prevent gerrymandering there, or just address that point sooner than later?
I certainly hope so. Well, and obviously when we get the official data, there will either be a number there or there won't be. I'm fairly sure it will be a 0 there. But I was surprised that they weren't ready to answer that question. But of course, to their credit, the statewide database folks were dealing with this, as you know, the census released their archaic data, and they've got lots of other issues they've been addressing. But I do expect they'll give us an answer. I just have no idea when. And of course, we will get a final answer in the official data. It'll either be there or not.
Okay, let's move on.
Okay, so we go back to sharing the screen. So number 2, the Federal Voting Rights Act. My kind of commoner's reference to it is geographic areas that have a concentration of voters from what the law calls a protected class. Generally, it means Latinos, Blacks or African Americans, Asian Americans, or Native Americans. Those geographic areas should not be divided in a way that dilutes their voting power. So it seems straightforward enough, but it can get extremely complicated, and that we'll spend a whole session on this law at the next discussion. One thing that does often trigger folks is they shouldn't be divided at all. So why is there references to divided? And that's because sometimes the populations are large enough to be a majority of 2 seats. So they could be divided in a way that does not dilute their voting power. So, but that's about as far as I'll go into today. And obviously we'll spend a lot of time on this at the next meeting. The California Voting Rights Act, it's often cited in lists of criteria, but there aren't actually any provisions in the law about how the lines are drawn. The law really determines, are you by district or not? So when those districts are drawn, the specific rules and provisions come out of the Federal Voting Rights Act for potential Voting Rights Act limits. So there is certainly something to be said for following the spirit and the intent of embodied by the California Voting Rights Act, but it doesn't give you specific things that we could look at and say you violated or you didn't. Then, as you see at the top of the slide here, I'm simply listing each provision in that list I showed you that mentions the various criterion from here on out. In this case, contiguity. So it's mentioned 3 times. And we get the language out of the state law, which is they should be geographically contiguous. And one question that has always come up in redistricting and been debated is, if they only touch at a point, is that considered contiguous? And California came out with the new law and said, no, a point does not count. The other issue that often comes up is water. If something's separated by water, the islands, obviously. How do you handle that? And the law says, ideally, they should be connected by bridge, tunnel, or regular ferry service. That should dictate where the island is connected. I will give credit to Daniel Phillips from the team. It's good to have someone local who knew this. He knew that actually the ferry service from the Channel Islands connects to Ventura County. So we don't have any bridge, tunnel, or regular ferry service that dictates where those islands should be connected. So you have flexibility in where they're assigned. It's less of an issue here where there's not really population out there than it is in places like Catalina and populated islands. So, to show you some examples, this is actually the city of Sacramento, which you can see, as many places do, has very odd borders. But under this definition of contiguity, narrow net connections are okay. So if you have a narrow arm to the jurisdiction, that's okay. You see the green check on District 2. But it used to be that if you jumped unincorporated territory for a city, or if you jumped another city that stuck in, that was okay. What would break contiguity was another district in between the two pieces. But now under this law, that's not allowed. So this District 1 in Sacramento, you can see how it jumps that territory would no longer be legal. Same thing, you can see where this point contiguity would come up. There was an effort, neighborhoods can cross city lines and other borders. So District 5 crossed, but didn't want to divide up the neighborhood right adjacent to it. So just connected at a point. That would no longer be legal because you're connected only at a point. But some strange shapes, as long as they're contiguous, as long as there's territory connecting them, those are okay. So District 3 would count as contiguous. We might debate whether it's compact, but it is contiguous. And where usually it's just common sense. All those you look at them, they seem to make sense. Where we run into this, I'll give you an example from Roanoke Park. There's the railroad running through the city, and it really acts as a community border. But they have another city coming inside that divides up the west of the railroad section. So the city these two neighborhoods wanted to be together, but they couldn't be. That would be non-contiguous under the new definition. And I should, a little shout out and thanks to Nicholas Heidorn from Common Cause and the Rose Institute down at Claremont McKenna College. They actually put together this the Sacramento City example. So I do want to give credit to them for that. It's very handy and we use it all the time now. But so that's where contiguity generally is common sense, but you can run into issues much more often at the city level. This kind of neighborhood crossing and non-contiguous piece is much more common at the city and rarely comes up at the county level where all that unincorporated territory gets included. So contiguity is pretty straightforward, much more difficult, and one that no doubt you will probably spend a lot of your time, perhaps more time discussing than anything else, is the idea of neighborhoods and communities of interest. So in the language of the law, they get blended together. But if you really break down the language, they are two separate things. A neighborhood is anything defined as a neighborhood. So it could be formally recognized by the county or by the city. Cities often will have official maps of neighborhoods. The big one is defined by public input. And of course, you can use your knowledge and your wisdom and your interpretations of the data as well to define them yourselves. So neighborhoods come fairly straightforward. They obviously, by definition, they're residential. Communities of interest is a much larger topic. The law does define it. And one of the tricks is that the law does, this is new. So it says a population that shares common social or economic interests. And I'm only reading this language because this will come up again and again. So shares common social or economic interests that should be included within a single supervisorial district for purposes of its effective and fair representation. So it is possible to have something like an industrial park or a purely commercial center that residents could testify actually does not benefit from being in a single supervisorial district. They'd obviously be a shared economic interest, but not benefit from being in a single district. It could be that they like having multiple representatives. So that would not count as a community of interest if that was the record that you had before you. But much more often, folks that share social and economic interests will want to be kept together and kept together in a single district and feel like that helps strengthen their voice. But we do run into neighborhoods occasionally. The most common one are retirement communities that say, we have no problem making our voice heard, and we actually want multiple supervisors listening to us. So you can get communities where the community testimony is fairly unanimous that they do not think they should be included within a single district for purposes of their effective and fair representation. So keep that in mind that there are those exceptions. The overwhelming majority of areas that have social or economic interests will want to be kept together. At the end here, I do mention one thing we find useful when people are wondering about are they a community of interest or not, is to ask them, is there an issue, in this case of county interest, that brings them together? You know, is there something that the county does that impacts them that they feel the county should do a certain way? If so, if there's an issue that ties them together, they're probably a community of interest, as long as it's not partisan and as long as it's not tied to an individual candidate or office holder, as long as it is a policy issue. For examples, you know, areas around parks, commercial corridors, you know, school and university neighborhoods, other neighborhoods or residents around a certain amenity or entity might identify as a neighborhood. Obviously, natural and man-made features can act as boundaries of communities of interest. They don't have to. Sometimes a hill actually can tie the two sides of a hill together if they share, say, an interest in open space. But those are possible boundaries. Very common ones are planning areas, historic zones, homeowners associations, or master plan communities, other things that were built and designed together, often consider themselves a community of interest. And then we mentioned already a lot of emphasis on shared demographic characteristics. And it's worth noting one thing that will be talked about later about Voting Rights Act is we talk a lot about race can be one consideration and one factor. It just can't be the predominant factor. So when MALDEF or the ACLU or the Voting Rights Act groups come in to make a case for a certain area being kept together and the argument that it should be kept together in the Voting Rights Act, they will, I don't think I've ever seen them not do this, where they won't just make their argument based on race. They will go into the economic and social characteristics that also tie that area together, such as shared language, language isolation, shared education levels, all those factors to establish that it's not just race, it's these community of interest elements that are tying them together. And then I already mentioned the shared issues or impacts. So those are good common examples, but anything's possible. This is where the community's voice really weighs in and where we really want to hear from folks. So to summarize, kind of definitions of community interest come from mostly from community testimony, but they can come from jurisdiction data. You get your school districts, you get your master plan communities. Those things can be the definitions of communities. And then social census and demographic data. You saw Daniel show you all those maps of education, language, all those other demographics that are in that ESRI map. All those things can be used as definitions of community. Some of the challenges that commissions and other entities run into is, what happens if groups disagree on whether something is an interest or whether two nearby areas are separate communities or one community? This is where you'll really have to exercise your discretion. People will disagree on what neighborhood they're in or what is the definition of their neighborhood. And then comes in the question of economic development zones, commercial corridors, those kinds of things. Are they communities of interest? And that's where we go turn often to testimony from those areas and from their neighbors. And then, as you probably have already spotted, that definition of effective and fair representation, that's a lot of discretion that you and the residents testifying to you have to exercise to determine what does that mean. I can't give you a easy, straightforward answer on that. So that, I suspect you'll be coming back a lot to that definition of community of interest, and that topic will be coming up again and again. But for now, let me move on to the next rule, which is cities and census designated places. This one's pretty straightforward, especially on cities. They're legally defined. They're really easy to identify because they have those legally defined boundaries. And one nice thing for the registrars is that precinct lines already stop at the city borders because that's how they run the city's elections. is all the precincts in the city. So some folks will talk about always being in this precinct. They want to, they work with their precinct neighbors and want to keep it together. That can tie into keeping cities together for precincts that are in cities. Census designated places, or CDPs, as they're often referred to. These are the Census Bureau's, it's an official agency, but they don't do it as viewing their definitions of CDPs as having any legal standing. They're just their effort to put population numbers to generally recognized unincorporated neighborhoods. So they're highly subjective. The Bureau would be the first to say, if our line is on one street and the residents say, no, we go 2 more streets over, the Bureau would be the first to defer to the local residents. They would not argue with locals at all on that, but they are useful in this process. And now the statute has given them legal standing as a consideration. So how do these pieces fit together? The next couple of images I'll show you are from something I presented to the State Commission a couple months ago. But when you, as I mentioned, cities are pretty straightforward. You look at a map, you can see Lancaster, Palmdale. That's pretty straightforward. But there's all this white space around them, the unincorporated area. So you have to get creative in how you define that. As Daniel Phillips mentioned to you, there are spheres of influence that are officially defined by the county's LAFCO agency. That definitely helps. So that can fill in the area right around a city. But that doesn't have statutory standing. That just kind of can fall into the community of interest because that's the area that the cities control planning for. But the CDPs give you a little more detail. So for example, a very common question, if you look at this map, is, well, we've got this white space in between, surrounded by, but in between Lancaster and Palmdale. Where should that go? Well, obviously, the sphere of influence information, LAFCO has addressed that and said the bottom part they felt should go with Palmdale, the top part should go with Lancaster. So that's a helpful guide for you. And you can get it right out of the data. You don't have to go get testimony on that. And then you get the census designated places. So the key thing with this is, for example, Quartz Hill, you get that the Lancaster sphere of influence portion of that area is a CDP, but the Palmdale portion is not in Quartz Hill. So that helps us know, okay, it's okay to divide up that unincorporated pocket because the LAFCO does and the CDP does. So you'd want to keep Quartz Hill together because that is a CDP that shows up in your criteria, but not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily need to be with the other portion of that county island. So, and again, all these elements are available on that interactive map that Daniel put together for you. So as you drill in and really as we start to get the big picture of the maps together, where the lines fall and where the population numbers start to come out, you'll run into all these questions of what's the best boundary here. And that's where you'll walk through your criteria and look at it. And CDPs will often be something you'll be looking at and trying to keep together in those unincorporated areas. The other thing that you'll be looking at is easily understood boundaries. This is make it easy for voters to tell their neighbors which district they're in and who else is in this district. I often say the beauty of this is when someone wants to get their neighbors to go out and knock on doors for a candidate, it's a lot easier to say, let's go knock on doors in District 2, which goes from the freeway to the railroad, than it is to say, well, it's the first block of Main Street, and then it goes up First Street, and then it goes up Second Street, and you end up knocking on the wrong doors. So that's where this idea comes from, of make it easy for voters to tell other voters where the boundary goes. Obviously, being in the same, keeping a city together is a huge benefit to that, because people generally know if they're in a city or not. But within a city or in unincorporated areas, you can use rivers, freeways, major roads. Interesting, I note on the third one here, railroads, rivers, creeks, and drainage channels are usually really good ones because they usually don't have many crossing points. So they tend to be neighborhood definitions as well. If it's really hard, if you have to go down the road a mile to get to the next bridge over a river, well, that river really acts as a community boundary. So that's a lot of the reason these are used. And just down here, I've got an example district. This is a weird shaped district. but it makes a lot of sense. It would actually be really easy, even though it's got this big triangle taken out of it. Well, you're using, the biggest boulevard in the city and the freeway as the boundary of that triangle. So it makes it really easy for voters to know if they're in or out, because they are following a river down here. It's a curvy line. It looks funny, but it's a river. So anyone in that neighborhood would know where that boundary is. So you can have some funny looking lines that do make sense because they're using easily understood boundaries. Then we get compactness. Compactness is always something people comment on, because the moment you look at a map, it either looks, pretty, nice, which means nice and compact, or it looks ugly with wavy lines and things that people tend to associate with being non-compact. And this happens so often, even Justice O'Connor on the US Supreme Court referred to compactness as something she knows when she sees it. There have been tons of academics trying to figure this out. Even the software that we use has 11 different mathematical formulas for calculating this. And they take all kinds of things. They measure the perimeter of the districts. They get more sophisticated with the ratio of a circle around a district to the actual bound perimeter of the district. So obviously perfectly compact shape is a circle. But of course you can't have a map of circles because they don't interlink very well. So you get all these formulas that come up. They really get into the details of values and ratios, and you get into debates of averages versus medians. So you can really go down a rat hole on compactness. Makes a little bit more sense if you look at maps. What's more compact? Well, 1 and 2 are not very compact looking. The black districts, the black colored in districts here, don't look very compact. 3 is better, but it has some odd shapes. 4 and 5 look better. And sure enough, you get different measures, and 4 and 5, the scores are much higher than 1 and 2. But you get weird things with these mathematical formulas. By the Polsby-Popper measure, district 2, the example 2 is more compact than the example 1. But by the population polygon measure, it flips. District 1 is the example 1 is more compact than example 2. So how the heck do you solve all this? One thing for those of you in the academia may recognize the names Polsby and Popper. There are 2 very well-known political scientists named Professor Polsby and Professor Popper. Oddly enough, these comments are not, this formula is not from those 2 professors. It's from 2 other professors that happen to also be named Polsby and Popper. So it's just a formula that gets used a lot because it's really quick to run. You hear Polsby Popper the most because it's very fast for me to run it on the computer, not because it has any special value. So thankfully, I'll come around. Thankfully, California put all these behind us. And we actually don't use any of these formulas under the California statute. But before I get into that detail, I do want to flag, as Justice O'Connor did, that compactness in an ugly shape is a flag saying, let's ask why it's shaped funny. It doesn't necessarily rule out the map itself. So in Arizona in 2001, it had this weird, the tan congressional district was this crazy shape coming. It actually used the Grand Canyon to connect one area to another. But the reason was that the Hopi Reservation, the white area at the end of it, is completely surrounded by the Navajo Reservation. And the 2 groups showed up at every single hearing the commission had. And the Hopi said again and again, we don't get along on legislative issues with the Navajo. There's only 6,000 of us. There's 100,000 of them. Give us our own voice, give us our own representative. And so that's why this community of interest was carved out and put into a different district. So not all crazy shapes are bad. This can be justified by community of interest. Similarly, this is a sanitation district, but you'll look at it just as lines and wow, what the heck is going on with these crazy lines? Why are all these jigs and jags? Well, when we put the city map over it, it turns out it's the city borders, the colors here, that have the jigs and jags. And the lines perfectly separate Lafayette from, I think it's Mountain View. It's not Mountain View, but from the neighboring cities. So even though the lines jig and jag, they do so for a very clear policy reason, which is to follow city borders and make the districts easy to understand. So keep in mind that crazy shapes always will get a crowd fired up and will kind of raise people's hackles. But the reason for crazy shapes is the important thing to look into. Which brings us to the compactness rule in California. As I mentioned, no formula is involved. It's a pretty simple rule. One area of population, nearby areas of population, should not be bypassed to get to another area of population. So to bring back this example, if there are people in these white areas that are not included in the black district, then you're bypassing a group of people to get to another group of people. And that would violate the compactness rule. So pretty straightforward, no math involved. You just look at the map, look and see if there are people there and say, okay, it either violates that or not. But keep in mind that compactness is the last of the criterion. Each time it appears, it's always last. And there can be very strong earlier reasons for non-compact districts. In LA County, we currently have this very stretched out District 1. Well, that is the district that was created by a Federal Voting Rights Act lawsuit in order to give Latinos their opportunity to elect their first Latino. And when you get into it, it actually makes some sense. The orange area above it is largely foothill communities. And then the pink area below it also starts to get up into the southern hills. So this is really the San Gabriel Valley seat going into downtown. So same thing with the wild looking District 4, which always raises questions. The reason for that is that District 2 is the historic African American or Black district in LA County. So yes, District 4 certainly would violate the compactness rule of bypassing one group of people for another, but it's doing it to achieve one of the higher range criterion. So just keep that in mind, that compactness is really, people jump to it because it's so obvious when you look at a map. But keep in mind, you then have to get into why are the shapes weird? Are they achieving one of the earlier criteria or not? So then we add, in this list, we now have this old may consider, that's now a shall consider reference to cohesiveness and integrity. As far as I know, and I'm open to correction on this, I'm not aware of either one of these terms really being litigated because, as I mentioned, they were may consider terms. It wasn't really a legal item you could kill a map on, so they were really challenged. There are different ways you could interpret it, both of these terms. Cohesiveness could be a simple reference to communities of interest. Let's tie those communities of interest together. Integrity could be a simple reference to contiguity. Or they could be looking at trying to have a cohesive nature to the whole district or something along that line. I'm kind of looking at different uses of the word through the history of redistricting. There really isn't a strong answer on that front that I know of. But I didn't want to skip over those terms because they do appear in your list of criteria. And then wrapping up, get to our prohibitions. You shall not consider incumbent or candidate locations, nor favor or discriminate against any incumbent, candidate, or party. Is there some room in there where you could look at something without favoring or considering or discriminating? You could certainly make a rhetorical debate about that. I think certainly it's much safer and much easier to just not look at any political party data or anything about where anyone lives, to just disregard that and not have it in your database at all. We have run into commissions where, people with agendas who are trying to torpedo the commission will actually try to cause problems by coming up and reading addresses of the elected officials into the record. And, they're really just being difficult. it's not a constructive exercise. But it is something that if it comes up, we'll have to address. And when it's in person, we've actually had, legal counsel just stop them, just order them to stop, and we cut off their mic because that's not supposed to be part of the record. So just to be aware of it. I like to think that given that this is the first independent redistricting commission for Santa Barbara, the residents will be invested enough in your success and goals that they won't play games like that. But it is just something to be aware of and not be surprised of. Sometimes there's nothing you can do about it except disregard it. And obviously, our suggestion is that neither we nor any of the official folks involved with you would bring any of this data to you for consideration. And the last slide is just some references where I got a lot of this language. You think this went on long? There's a lot more information there that you can really dig into. These are from the Asian Americans Advancing Justice at the bottom, National Conference of State Legislatures in the middle, and then actually Justin Levitt's website, all about redistricting, has quite a bit of this information as well. So with that, I will stop and move to questions. So,
who wants to start? Who's got a question? Let's see. Somebody. Anybody on the commission want to jump in with anything? Mr. McClintock and then Mr. Bradley.
Thanks, Doug. That was great. Very informative. Just to be clear on the issue of various analytics for measuring compactness, there's no rule that requires a formula that imposes like our use of a particular measure of compactness, but you will be helping us evaluate compactness using those various metrics, right?
If you want to, we can, if there are questions, and in particular, if you come down to it where there's, a cost of a coin or a toss of a coin, we can certainly run those numbers for you. Like I mentioned, some of them take a couple seconds. Some of them can take half an hour to run. So we do run into those issues, but we can run them if there's an issue where you're choosing between two maps and that could help you, we're happy to do it. And some of the online tools, mapping tools, actually let people run those on maps as they're drawing them, or you can use those tools to run them, from home yourself with the maps that are up there as well.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you.
Mr. Bradley.
I think Commissioner Rios was before me, actually. No? Okay. With respect to cohesiveness, could you, we were looking at various examples in your presentation of static factors like commercial corridors and such. When we're dealing with commuting, I know Santa Barbara County has something like 150,000 commuters who drive during a normal year when we're not all locked down working from home. How is commuting weighed, at least in terms of cohesiveness and contiguousness? For example, people in District 1 may often commute into Districts 2 and 3, or people in 3 may commute into District 2 or 1. How does that weigh in?
Yeah, I'm certainly sympathetic. I once was caught in traffic from Santa Barbara to Ventura, going through Montecito, behind a car that actually had a license plate frame that said Ventura Dad just trying to get home. That actually made a license plate frame talking about that. So in terms of contiguity, it's not an issue. The contiguity is just a straightforward, do they touch or not question. On the community of interest and cohesiveness question, it's a tough question. I don't think there is good guidance I can give you. It really comes down to in my view, it comes down to your discretion. And, if someone's making a claim that these two areas are connected because people live here and work there and have shared concerns, you'd have to weigh how effectively you think that they made that argument.
Commissioner Rios, did you have a question? Nope. Okay. Others?
Well, you're a lot to digest.
While you're all thinking about it for a moment, I think there's at least one hand raised on the attendee side. So Ms. Tilton, let's take that comment.
We have a request to speak from Andy Caldwell.
Welcome back, Mr. Caldwell.
Thank you, Chair Morris. I have one question for Doug Johnson and then a policy consideration. The question for Doug is Vandenberg Air Force Base. We know about the prison. What about the base? You have a lot of people out there that are on temporary duty. You may have people coming and going for various missions. How will they handle the population there?
Yeah, so the population is counted as of April 1st of 2020. And it's supposed to be people who are, at least semi-permanent there. So if someone's, staying in a hotel while they're traveling or, there to watch a rocket launch, they would not be counted. They'd be counted back home. If they're based there for, a 1 year or 2 year term, then yeah, that's their home. But it does come down to who's counted by the census. You can get into, Vandenberg is a CDP. It is one whose boundaries might be hotly contested. All of you should look at that interactive site and see how they define the CDP. There are different definitions of what is Vandenberg that you can look at. And obviously people might say the community outside the base is obviously closely tied to the base itself. So they should be considered all, those folks could say it would all be one community of interest. So that issue you can wrestle with, but the count is supposed to be people who are at least semi-permanently there as of April 1st of 2020. And it'll be the number that we get from the census, whatever that number ends up being.
Well, if I could add one comment to that, we were involved in a voter registration drive one time, and the base wouldn't let us on because they didn't want their people to register to vote here because they didn't want them to have to pay taxes here. And I'd hate to see if they got counted in our census when they're actually registered voters at some other permanent home address. So that's something I think that should be considered. So my policy question to you, and this is a very, very serious question, and I think your commission needs to decide this early on. During the presentation from the other redistricting commissioners from Arizona and California, one of the things they suggested is that you, the commission, not draw a map. Remember that? They said, don't draw a map. Well, what are we doing right now? You guys are getting a full-blown seminar on how to draw a map. You might be getting a seminar on how to judge a map that is submitted by the public. But here's the deal. The public's not going to have hour after hour after hour on the issue of the nuances of these, 10 criteria. So we've kind of got a chicken and an egg thing. You don't even have the consensus numbers, and the community hasn't started drawing maps. And so you're front loading yourself with all this information that the public won't have when they draw their maps. And I think it's going to be a really delicate thing for you to determine when are we judging the maps or are we going to be drawing maps ourselves if nothing comes in or we don't like them or we don't think they're up to the criteria. I think kind of outlining this early on could help the public, especially in your outreach to them, to determine how much of this information you're getting right now you try to pass on to them so that the maps will comport to the law.
Yep, Mr. Chairman, if I can address that a little bit. So Mr. Caldwell makes some very good points, and actually, I don't know if you realize this, but he ties right into some of the arguments behind the Fair Maps Act. So I didn't go into the timing pieces today, but the Fair Maps Act actually requires a brief pause. When the official data comes out, there's a window of time where the commission and its consultants cannot draw maps in order to give the public the chance to go first. Now, because of the delays with the COVID, once you get too close to the deadline, that window shrinks and eventually goes away. So depending on when we get the data, it might be a very small window, but the public will certainly have some opportunity first to draw first. And and exactly right. I would love the chance to spend an hour presenting this information to every resident. The residents will have a little bit of a leg up though, because I'm hitting you with everything. What the residents will have to wrestle with is when they draw their maps and come down to finishing their maps, they really only have to focus on the questions along the borders of their seats. So hopefully it'll be easier for them to research just the issues that impact their map. They won't have to get into everything. But it is true, there's a lot to consider. And whether you're drawing maps or judging them, you will be judging first because you'll see the public maps before you have to get into the question of whether you want to give direction to draw your own maps.
Good. Ms. Pratsky.
I just need a clarification on that, Doug, because in that previous presentation, they did say that we wouldn't be drawing the maps, that NDC would be drawing the maps, and that, so I really, how will that process happen?
Sure. My impression, and I might be misinterpreting, I think when the commenter references the commission drawing maps, they're including NDC with you. So they're suggesting, and it makes a lot of sense if it works, is that the commission, that we simply help you judge maps and the commission really judge amongst maps that the residents submit. Now, in an ideal world, that's our gold standard too. We love that. Given the time limits, you may find that, what often happens is there's map A that you really love the north of and map B that you really love the south of. And if we have time, you can say that to the public and someone in the public will draw that for you. If you don't have time, you may just have to say, NDC, can you draw this so we can post it tonight, kind of thing. But yes, I think you did get strong advice that the commissioners yourselves not personally be drawing maps. You're not barred from doing so, but we did hear from the commissioners that does lead to challenges and complications. And then I think what's this commenter I think was saying, and forgive me if I'm misunderstanding, and certainly you'll hear later, is the not even NDC draw maps. That simply you judge from maps that the residents submit. And if you come to a map that residents submit that you like, that's our favorite project too. So we're 100% on board with that. So.
Well, and I think that makes sense that we defer, right? Because, I draw a map, I'm sure it's the best map ever drawn. And I'm going to believe that throughout the process, and that's going to color my evaluation of anybody else's map. So if I think that's where that encouragement's coming from is, don't own a child in this process, right?
Right.
Yeah. Anybody else? This is another good example, Doug, I think, of why we need a website that has more than our agendas on it. Because this kind of information in bite-sized chunks that are easy for people to understand would be very helpful as we start talking to folks, to be able to refer them to something that's not very deep in a 2-hour video recording of a meeting.
That's exactly our goal, definitely, to pull out resources.
Okay, going once, going twice. Last chance to ask him any questions about this. Mr. Bradley.
I have a question about the Los Padres Forest. It exists in our county. It's huge. And I'm just kind of wondering about its impact on how we draw maps. If you look at the current district maps, for example, District 1 spans Coyama Valley all the way down to Carpinteria. And then of course we have far-reaching District 3. Should we, since there are private inholdings and residents who live within Los Padres on federally leased land, how does that exist? It's not a natural geographic feature. It's a political feature, really. But how does that compare with a geographic feature?
It's likely to be a great example of this question of, does it benefit from being in a single district? We actually went through this with the city of Claremont. The entire north end of Claremont is similarly a preserve. And so there was a lot of debate about, if it all ends up in one district, Does that mean the other 4 council members don't really care about it? And there can be different interpretations and different answers to that. Where Claremont came down is that, no, so many Claremont residents go up there to hike and picnic and all that. It doesn't matter that the Southern Council member's district doesn't include part of the preserve. That Southern Council member is going to care about the preserve because the residents that he represents or she represents and that vote on that go up there and care about it. But you could equally say that maybe it should be divided up into 2 or 3 seats. The magic number is always, can you get a majority of the board who represents that area? It might be tricky to get 3 board seats that touch the Los Padres, given the other criteria. But that's where that decision comes down of, is it a community of interest that benefits from being in a single district, or is it not? And that's up to your judgment in the end, based on what you hear from the public, of course. I know it sounds like I'm dodging a lot of these questions. My apologies for that, but this is why computers have not yet gotten to the point where they can just draw the map for you and punch it out. There's a lot of these judgment calls.
Well, and Doug, you'll recall when the city of Santa Maria went to districts, we had a similar but different outcome surrounding our downtown core.
Yep.
And a number of organizations really advocated that the downtown core be included in all 4 district, city council districts for that very reason, that we wanted everybody paying attention on it when it came to resources. And that was the ultimate choice. But it could have probably would have been easier to draw the maps. It would have been a different outcome, but that was the community's preference.
Yeah.
So, okay. Once again, anybody got a last question? No. Well, I'm sure we will be coming back to this as at least in refresher conversations. And as we get into the training materials we're going to use in our public outreach. So Doug, appreciate you taking us through this in detail this evening, and sure won't be the last time we have a conversation about what were those criteria again?
Yep, exactly.
Very good. So commissioners, that takes us to item number 9, which is a chance for us to check in and make sure that we have teed up the items we want the staff to be prepared to either conduct training or discussions in future agendas. I think we've got next week. Let me see if I can. Somebody's got that list close. Shalice, I'm sure you do.
Yes, I can read it for the group. It's we have our training number 5, which will be the Federal Voting Rights Act, and that will be by our legal counsel. We have demonstration and discussion of public mapping tools and the related budget issues related to those tools. We have an update that was requested on the work that Dr. Phillips had done on the GIS data and maps collections from the other counties and the city governments. And then we did have a request that I'm not sure this is going to necessarily be an agenda item, but examples of other past commissions experiences. This might not be a standalone, but may be incorporated into some of our outreach discussions.
And so I know the training on the Federal Voting Rights Act, we've got tentatively calendared for our next meeting. Have we kind of thought about how the rest of those get chopped up into reasonable sized agendas?
We don't have kind of a list which would come up in which meetings item. It's worth noting too, of course, outreach will become, I think, a bigger and bigger part of each discussion as we go forward. So that's to know about.
So let me just take a moment and ask the commissioners if there's anything in addition to those 4 bullet items that you want to add to that list, at least right now. I'm sure there'll be things that come up later, but Mr. Bray.
Thank you, Chair. Morris, I don't know if this is an agenda item or not, But I would like to just throw out, one of my great concerns is the tremendous number of public meetings we're required to have. I think the number's 14. At some point, should we start locking in dates as a milestone to work towards as we march towards December? And when would we do that?
And Jim, if you would, I think I would add to that as part of that same conversation. You know, at some point, we probably need to have a discussion about is that calendar feasible, and or do we need to figure out a mechanism to push the back end of the calendar into the next calendar year? It's not something. My suspicion is that's not something we can do on our own discretion. And so we probably are going to need legal counsel to weigh in on what that strategy and process would look like and when we would want to trigger, you know, if we feel like, you know, to your point, Jim, you know, when you calendar that out, we run out of weeks. You know, so maybe doing that in the next, you know, Doug, as you're thinking about agendas, maybe having that discussion in the next 2 or 3 meetings would be appropriate.
Yes, I think, I don't know if we can pull together kind of a rough schedule and time for the next meeting, but certainly by the one after that. I'd say either the next meeting or one after that will come to you to get that discussion going with kind of a very broad, big picture. This is what we're looking at time-wise. This is the challenges it presents. How do you want to address those challenges?
Some of those required meetings we could potentially do before the release of data. So that'll all factor in as you kind of lay that out, I'm sure.
Yep. And we'll get together and cooperate on that. Just exactly what you're saying. There are things you can do even before the census comes. There are other sources of data, and we may decide that waiting until September, and hoping it's at least September, may be too long. So we'll come back to you with a shared recommendation.
Thank you. Anything else folks want to add to the agendas? Start staff working on for future meetings. Very good. So that leads us, I believe, to the potential for a closed session. And Mr. Orden, I think last we talked, we do not need to go into session tonight, or has something changed?
Nothing has changed, and so I wanted to have that on the agenda, but I do not think that it's necessary for us to go to a closed session.
Very good. Well, I like that. With that, let me just pause for a quick moment. Anything else that members of the commission need to bring up, kind of a good of the order items? If not, our next meeting is scheduled for 2 weeks from today on the 21st. And I will make sure that I know that it's at 6 p.m. and we'll be all here ready to go. Appreciate everybody's participation this evening, and I look forward to catching up with everybody again in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Thanks, everybody.